The cold morning light crept across the floor of Silas Cole's cabin, touching everything in its slow, deliberate way. It found the iron legs of the bed where he'd slept alone for 10 years. It found the single tin cup hanging on its nail by the dry sink. And it found the cast iron skillet sitting on the stove, seasoned black by a decade of solitude, but this morning reflecting something that stopped the eye, a sliver of calico fabric where no calico had ever been before. Silas stood at the window, looking out at the Wyoming land that stretched forever in every direction. November 1889. The calendar on his wall said so, though days tended to blur together when you lived 17 miles from the nearest town and your only regular visitors were the wind and whatever small creatures decided to cross your path. He was 42 years old, though he looked older. The kind of old that comes from working ground that doesn't want to be worked, from winters that test whether you really want to see another spring. His hands were cracked and thick from rope and reins and the constant battle with things that needed fixing. Those hands now rested on the windowsill as he watched the sun climb over the Bighorn Mountains, painting the snow on their peaks in shades of pink and gold. The skillet sat behind him, waiting. The calico reflection had vanished when he'd moved past it earlier, but the question of it remained in his mind like a splinter he couldn't find. He turned from the window and walked to the stove. He picked up the skillet, felt its familiar weight, ran his thumb along the handle where years of use had worn the iron smooth. He'd bought it in Cheyenne in 1879, the same year he'd bought this land, this cabin, this life. It had been new then, rough and grey. Now it was black and slick and felt like part of his arm. He set it back down and built a fire in the stove. The kindling caught quickly, the smell of pine smoke filling the small space. Outside, the wind picked up, pushing against the cabin walls like something trying to get in. Winter was coming. He could feel it in his joints, in the way the sky held that particular shade of grey that meant snow before long. The cabin was one room, 16 feet by 20, built from logs he'd cut and hauled himself. A bed in one corner. A table with 2 chairs, though the second chair had never been used. A dry sink with a chipped porcelain basin. Shelves holding canned goods and coffee and the few books he owned. An iron cross on the wall above the bed, his mother's before she died, the only thing he'd kept from the life he'd left behind in Ohio. He made coffee, ground from beans he'd bought 3 months ago in Laramie. The grinding sound filled the cabin, rhythmic and familiar. Through it, he heard something else, hooves, many of them, passing on the trail about a quarter-mile east. He stopped grinding and listened. The sound grew, then faded. Riders heading toward the pass. He counted maybe 8 or 10 horses. Too many for a family moving. Too organized for travelers. Posse, probably. Sheriff Maddox from Laramie had been chasing something or someone for the past week. Silas had seen dust on the horizon, heard rumors in town during his last supply run, but he hadn't paid much attention. Other people's troubles weren't his concern. He poured the coffee into his cup, the only cup, and drank it standing at the window. Black. Bitter. Hot enough to remind him he was alive. The day passed like most days passed. He checked on the 3 cows he kept for milk and beef, the ones he'd brought down from the higher pasture before the snow could trap them up there. He split wood until his shoulders burned and his breath came in white clouds. He repaired a section of fence where the wire had gone slack. Small work. Necessary work. The kind that kept a man from thinking too much. By afternoon, the clouds had thickened and the temperature had dropped. Silas stood by the spring that had made him choose this spot for his cabin, a steady flow of cold, clear water that ran year-round, even in the drier summers. He knelt to drink, and that's when he saw it. A boot print. Small. The toe pointed toward the cabin, then away. The edges were still sharp, not yet blurred by the wind. Recent. Today, maybe. And not his boot. He stared at it for a long moment. Then, without thinking about why, he reached down and smoothed it over with his palm, erasing it completely. The dirt was cold against his skin. He stood, wiped his hand on his pants, and walked back to the cabin without looking back. Supper was beans and salt pork, eaten at the table with the empty chair watching him. He read by lamplight for an hour, a book about farming techniques in drier climates, borrowed from a man in town who'd never asked for it back. The wind moaned around the cabin corners. The fire popped and settled. He was thinking about bed when he heard it. A horse. Running hard. Then a scream. The high, terrible scream of a horse in trouble. Then a single gunshot, muffled by distance and wind, but unmistakable. Silas was on his feet before he knew he'd moved. His rifle was in his hands, the cold stock against his palm, the weight of it familiar and solid. He pulled on his coat, kicked open the door, and stepped into the night. The wind hit him like something alive. The temperature had dropped further, below freezing now, maybe into the teens. Snow wouldn't be far behind. He followed the sounds, his boots crunching on frozen ground, his breath visible in front of his face. He found the horse first. It was a mare, dark brown, lying on its side at the bottom of a shallow ravine. Its leg was twisted at an angle no leg should bend, broken in a gopher hole, probably, the ground giving way beneath its weight. The animal was still alive, its sides heaving, its eyes wild with pain and fear. It tried to lift its head when it saw Silas, tried to rise, but the leg wouldn't cooperate and it fell back with a sound that was almost human. Silas raised his rifle. One shot, clean and quick. The horse went still. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunshot had been. Then he saw her. A woman, crumpled against a rock outcropping 20 feet from the horse. She'd been thrown clear, maybe, or had tried to jump. One foot was bare, the boot gone, lost somewhere in the dark. Her dress was dark wool, practical for travel, but there was a darker stain spreading across her left shoulder, black in the moonlight. Silas approached slowly, his rifle still in his hands but pointed at the ground. She didn't move. For a moment he thought she was dead, that the gunshot he'd heard had been hers, a mercy killing for the horse or for herself. He knelt beside her. Her face was young, 25, maybe, pale beneath the dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her hair had come loose from whatever had held it, dark strands tangled across her cheek. He reached out to check for breath, for pulse, for anything. Her eyes opened, and her hand shot up and grabbed his wrist with strength that seemed impossible for someone who'd just been thrown from a horse and shot. Her fingers dug into his skin, her grip fierce and desperate. Her eyes, grey, like the sky before a storm, found his and held. She didn't speak. Couldn't speak, maybe. But she didn't have to. Everything she needed to say was in that grip, in those eyes, in the way she held onto him like he was the difference between living and dying. Silas looked at her. Then he looked toward the ridge, toward the trail where the posse had passed earlier, toward the town and the sheriff and the life he'd built on being alone. The wind howled. Snow began to fall, the first flakes landing on her face, melting against her skin. He made his choice. He slipped one arm beneath her shoulders, another beneath her knees, and lifted. She was lighter than she should have been, her body limp against his chest now, the effort of grabbing him having taken whatever strength she had left. Her head fell back, her hair brushing against his arm, and he started walking toward the cabin. The snow fell harder. The wind pushed against him. And Silas Cole, who had spent 10 years keeping the world at arm's length, carried a stranger through the growing dark toward the only warm place he knew. Sometimes the choices that change everything happen in seconds. Sometimes you don't even know you're making one until you're already living it. For Silas, that moment came on a cold November night in Wyoming, carrying a woman he'd never met toward a life he'd never imagined. The cabin door creaked open. The fire had burned low but still glowed. He laid her on his bed, the first time another person had ever slept there, and went to find his medical kit and a clean knife. Behind him, the snow continued to fall, covering tracks, covering trails, covering the past. Whatever tomorrow would bring, tonight there was only this, a man who'd forgotten what it meant to need anyone, and a woman who needed him now more than she'd ever needed anyone in her life. The skillet sat on the cold stove, its black surface reflecting the firelight. And for the first time in 10 years, it reflected more than one face in its dark, patient iron. The weight of her pressed against his chest as he pushed through the cabin door. Silas had carried 100-pound sacks of grain up from the wagon plenty of times. This was different. This was warm and soft and bleeding onto his shirt, and every step sent a fresh wave of that metallic smell into the cold air between them. He laid her on the bed. His bed. The quilts his mother had made decades ago, the ones he'd packed in a trunk and carried across 3 states, now gathered beneath a stranger whose face had gone the color of tallow. Her eyes were closed. Her chest moved, but barely. The dark stain on her shoulder had spread, soaking through the wool of her dress and onto the fabric beneath. Silas stood there for a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, his hands hanging at his sides like they'd forgotten what to do. Then he moved. The medical kit was on the shelf next to the canned peaches. He'd put it together years ago after watching a man die from an infected cut, something a little iodine could have stopped. He grabbed it, his fingers fumbling with the latch. Inside, bandages rolled tight, a bottle of whiskey he didn't drink, a curved needle with thread already through it, and a small tin of something the doctor in Laramie had called carbolic salve. He set it on the table. Then he went back to the bed. The fire had burned low. He added wood, 3 pieces, watching until the flames caught and grew. More light. More heat. He needed both. Kneeling beside the bed, he looked at the wound. Through the tear in her dress, he could see the edges of it, ragged, dark, still seeping. The bullet had gone through, maybe. Or maybe it was still inside. He wouldn't know until he looked. His hand shook. Just a little. He noticed and hated it. He found his knife on the table, the one he used for everything from skinning rabbits to cutting rope. He held the blade in the fire until the metal glowed, then pulled it back and waited for the heat to fade to something less than destruction. "I'm sorry about the dress," he said to no one. To her. To himself. The first cut was the hardest. The wool parted, revealing a layer of linen beneath. That parted too, and then he was looking at skin. Her skin. Pale and smooth and broken by a wound that punched a hole through everything. The bullet had gone through. Clean exit, maybe. He could see both sides now, the smaller entry in front, the larger tear in back where the lead had pushed through. The bleeding had slowed, which meant she might live, which meant he had a chance. He cleaned the wounds with whiskey. She didn't move, didn't flinch, and that scared him more than if she'd screamed. He spread the salve across both openings, watching it melt against her skin. Then he wrapped the bandages around her shoulder, around her chest, around and around until the white cloth held everything in place. His hands left blood on the bandages. His blood or hers, he couldn't tell. He sat back on his heels. The fire crackled. The wind pushed against the windows. The woman on his bed breathed, each rise and fall of her chest a small miracle he hadn't expected to witness. Hours passed. He didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the table, the one that faced the bed, and watched her. The lamplight made shadows dance across her face. She was young. Younger than he'd first thought. 23. Maybe. 24. Lines around her eyes suggested she'd done some living, some worrying, but the skin of her face was smooth, unweathered by the kind of years that had carved his own features into leather. Sometime around midnight, she moved. Just her head, turning slightly on the pillow. Her lips parted, and a sound came out, not a word, not quite a moan, just a noise that meant she was still fighting whatever war had brought her here. Silas got up and knelt beside her again. He dipped a cloth in water and pressed it to her lips, letting a few drops fall into her mouth. Her tongue moved. Her throat worked. She swallowed. He did this through the night. Water. More water. Checking the bandages. Adding wood to the fire. Watching the window for light that seemed like it would never come. Dawn broke grey and cold. The snow had stopped sometime before first light, leaving a fresh blanket over everything. Silas stood at the window and looked out at his world, transformed by white. Somewhere out there, a dead horse lay in a ravine. Somewhere out there, tracks that might have led here were buried under 6 inches of new snow. He turned back to the bed. Her eyes were open. She was watching him. Had been watching him, maybe for a while. Her grey eyes moved across his face, studying him the way he'd studied her through the night. They held no fear. That was the first thing he noticed. Pain, yes. Weakness, certainly. but not fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but she got there first. "You're not a lawman." Her voice was rough, scraped raw by whatever had happened before the fall. But the words were clear. Certain. A statement dressed up like a question. Silas shook his head. No. Something moved in her eyes. Relief, maybe. Or just acknowledgement. She closed them again, and for a terrible moment he thought she'd slipped away. But her chest kept rising. Kept falling. She was just resting. Gathering strength. He made coffee. The sounds of morning, the grind of beans, the crackle of fire, the whistle of the pot, felt wrong somehow, too normal for a day that had started with a stranger in his bed. He drank his coffee standing at the window, watching the ridge where he'd seen riders yesterday. The posse. They'd been looking for someone. A woman, probably. The kind of woman who'd be riding alone at night, who'd push a horse until it broke a leg in a hole, who'd end up shot and bleeding in the Wyoming wilderness. He looked back at the bed. At the fine wool of her dress, now cut and ruined. At the delicate stitching on the collar, the kind of work you didn't find on clothes from the general store. At her hands, which lay still on his quilt, nails clean and shaped, skin uncalloused. She wasn't a farmer's wife. Wasn't a settler's daughter. She was something else entirely, and that something else had brought a sheriff's posse into his valley for the first time in 10 years. The coffee burned his tongue. He didn't notice. Around noon, she woke again. This time she tried to sit up, and the pain hit her like a physical force. Her face went white, her jaw clenched, and a sound escaped her, sharp, short, cut off before it could become a scream. Silas was at her side in 3 steps. His hands went to her shoulders, gently pushing her back down. Easy. You'll start the bleeding again. She fought him. Just for a second, just with her eyes, but he saw it, the instinct to resist, to push back against anyone who tried to hold her still. Then something shifted in her face, and she relaxed against the pillow. Thirsty, she said. Just that. One word. He brought water. She drank from the tin cup he held to her lips, her eyes on his the whole time. When she'd had enough, she turned her head away and looked around the cabin. The shelves. The table. The empty chair. The iron cross on the wall. How long? She asked. Since I found you. 12 hours, maybe. She processed that. 12 hours in a stranger's bed. 12 hours of being looked at, touched, cared for. Her eyes moved back to him. You took the bullet out. Went through. I just cleaned it. Wrapped it. She nodded, a small movement that cost her. Her hand came up from beneath the quilt, trembling with effort, and touched the bandages on her shoulder. Her fingers explored the edges of the wrapping, the thickness of it. Thank you, she said. The words were quiet. Simple. But they landed in Silas's chest like stones in still water. He didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to respond to gratitude from a woman who'd been shot and left for dead. A woman whose very presence in his cabin could bring trouble down on them both. So he said nothing. Just stood there, holding the empty cup, feeling the weight of her eyes on him. What's your name? She asked. Silas Cole. She tested it. Silas. Nodded again. I'm Alara. Alara what? A pause. A flicker in those grey eyes. Just Alara. For now. Fair enough, he thought. He had secrets too. Everyone did, out here. The West was built on secrets and the people who ran from them. The afternoon passed in a kind of suspended time. Silas went about his chores, feeding the cows, bringing in wood, checking the spring. Each time he went outside, he scanned the ridges. Each time he came back in, he found her watching the door, waiting for him to return. She ate a little that evening. Bread soaked in broth, soft enough to swallow without much chewing. He held the bowl while she ate, spooning the mixture into her mouth like she was a child. She hated it. He could see that in the set of her jaw, the way she wouldn't meet his eyes. But she was too weak to feed herself, and they both knew it. Afterward, she slept again. The fever came that night, as he'd known it would. her skin flush hot, her forehead damp with sweat. She thrashed on the bed, muttering words he couldn't understand, names he didn't recognize. He changed the bandages. He pressed cold cloths to her face and neck. He talked to her in a low voice, saying anything that came to mind, about the weather, about his cows, about the time he'd seen a bear cub wander through the yard and scare himself more than he'd scared anyone. Whether she heard him, he couldn't say. But it helped him, this talking. Made him feel less like a ghost haunting his own life. By the third day, the fever broke. She woke in the early morning, weak as a newborn, but clear-eyed and present. She looked at him sitting in the chair by the bed, his head nodding with exhaustion, and something shifted in her expression. "You stayed," she whispered. Silas opened his eyes. Met her gaze. "Where would I go?" She didn't answer. Didn't need to. They both knew what he meant, not that he had nowhere to go, but that he'd chosen to be here, with her, instead of anywhere else in the world. The snow had melted some, revealing patches of brown earth. The ridge was visible again, empty against the sky. For now, they were alone. For now, they were safe. Silas looked at Alara, at the woman who'd fallen into his life like a stone into still water, and wondered what ripples she'd leave behind. Whatever they were, he was already in the middle of them. Already changed. Already different from the man who'd woken up 3 mornings ago to a life of quiet solitude. He reached for the water cup, and she took it from him this time, her fingers brushing against his. The touch lasted only a second. But it was enough. Sometimes the smallest connections change everything. Sometimes you don't recognize the moment until much later, when you look back and see the exact place where your life divided into before and after. For Silas Cole, that moment came on a November morning in Wyoming, passing a cup of water to a woman named Alara, and feeling, for the first time in 10 years, that he wasn't alone. 3 weeks had passed since the night Silas carried Alara through his cabin door. December now. The snow that had fallen that first night had been joined by more, then more again, until the world outside existed in shades of white and grey. The cabin had become its own small universe, 16 feet by 20, with a fire that never went out and 2 people learning how to share the same air. Alara healed slowly. The wound on her shoulder closed, leaving a puckered scar that she touched sometimes when she thought Silas wasn't looking. She could sit up now, could walk to the table and back, could help with small tasks, mending, cooking, cleaning. The fever was a memory, though it had left her thinner than she'd been, her cheekbones more pronounced, her wrists fragile looking against the wool sleeves of the shirt she wore. His shirt. One of his old shirts, because her dress was ruined and she had nothing else. The fabric hung loose on her frame, and she'd rolled the sleeves 3 times to free her hands. She wore it like it was the finest thing she'd ever owned, and something about that caught at Silas in a way he couldn't explain. The days took on a rhythm. Morning coffee, him at the window, her at the table. Afternoon chores, him outside chopping wood or checking on the cows, her inside tending the fire or reading one of his books. Evening meals, simple things, beans and salt pork, bread baked in the cast-iron skillet, coffee that grew weaker as their supplies dwindled. Nights by the fire, him in his chair, her on the bed, the space between them filled with words or silence, depending on the hour. She talked sometimes. Not about the past, not about how she'd ended up shot and alone in the Wyoming wilderness, but about other things. About books she'd read. About a garden she'd once tended, full of flowers she could name in Latin. About the way light fell across mountains in the evening, how it was different here than anywhere else she'd been. He listened. That was the strange part. Silas Cole, who'd spent 10 years talking to cows and himself, found himself wanting to hear her voice, wanting to know what she thought about small things and large things and everything in between. "You don't ask," she said one evening. Mid-December. The fire popped and settled between them. He looked up from the sock he was darning, one of his, the heel worn thin. "Ask what?" "Why I'm here. What happened? Who shot me?" Silas considered this, ran his needle through the wool, pulled it tight. "Figure you'll tell me when you're ready. Or you won't. Either way, it's your story." She watched him for a long moment, her grey eyes catching the firelight. Then she looked away, at the flames, at the shadows dancing on the walls. "My father was a professor," she said quietly, "in Philadelphia. He taught history at the university there. He had books, hundreds of them, floor to ceiling in every room. He used to say that if you understood the past, you could survive anything the future threw at you." Silas kept darning, kept listening. "I met a man, a student of his, years ago. He was charming, intelligent, everything a young woman might want. My father approved. They talked for hours about history, about philosophy, about the shape of things." She paused, swallowed. He wasn't what he seemed. The fire crackled. A log shifted, sending sparks up the chimney. "When I found out what he really was, what he'd done, what he planned to do, I tried to leave. He wouldn't allow it. So I did something I never thought myself capable of." Her voice dropped lower. "I stopped him. Permanently." Silas set down his darning. Looked at her fully now, this woman in his shirt, sitting on his bed, telling him things that could hang her. His brother is a powerful man. He has money, connections, men who do what he says. He's been hunting me since last spring. Across Pennsylvania, into Ohio, through Illinois, across the plains. He caught up with me outside Laramie. I ran. My horse ran. And then— "The ravine," Silas said. "The gunshot." She nodded. "He shot me. Or one of his men did. I don't remember much after that. Just falling. And then you." Silas sat with this. With the weight of it, the shape of it, the reality of a woman who'd done what she had to do and was running still. "That's quite a story," he said finally. "It's true. Every word." "I believe you." She looked at him, surprised. "Just like that?" He shrugged. "I've been alive long enough to know when someone's lying. You're not." Something moved in her face. Gratitude, maybe. Or just relief at being believed, at being seen. The days continued. Christmas came and went, marked only by a better meal than usual and a small carved bird Silas left on the table for her. A wren, he said, because he'd seen one at the spring last summer and it had reminded him of her. She held it for a long time, turning it over in her hands, and when she looked up her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with tears. January arrived with cold so bitter it cracked the window pane. Silas spent a full day sealing it with canvas and prayer, his fingers numb, his breath freezing in his beard. Alara watched from the bed, wrapped in every quilt they had, her face worried. "Will we make it through?" she asked. "We always do." She heard the word. We. Heard it and held it close, warming herself on it like the fire. But something was changing between them. Silas felt it in the way he looked for her when he came inside, in the way his eyes found her across the room without meaning to, in the way her name had become a constant presence in his mind, a background hum beneath every thought. He'd been alone so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to need someone, to want someone, to lie awake at night listening to another person breathe and feel that sound as essential as his own heartbeat. It scared him. More than winter, more than the posse that might still be out there, more than anything he'd faced in years. One night he caught his reflection in the window. The glass was dark, the fire behind him, and he saw himself clearly, a man of 42, weathered and worn, standing in a cabin that had been his whole world for a decade. Behind him, Alara sat by the fire, mending another of his shirts, humming a tune he didn't recognize. She looked up, caught his eye in the reflection, and smiled. And Silas understood something he'd been avoiding for weeks. He wasn't a protector. He was a man who'd been hiding, just like her. He'd built this cabin, this life, this solitude, as a fortress against a world that had hurt him once, long ago. He'd told himself he was self-sufficient, independent, free. But freedom wasn't the same as loneliness, and independence wasn't the same as whole. The loneliness he'd mistaken for strength was just emptiness, and she had filled it without even trying. He turned from the window, walked to the fire, sat in his chair and looked at her, really looked, the way a man looks at something he's afraid to lose. "We need to talk," he said. She set down the mending. Waited. "If the snow melts and they come back, the posse, his men, whoever, I need to know what we are facing." Alara nodded slowly. "His name is Garrett Walsh. He owns half of Philadelphia, or acts like he does. He has money for guns, for men, for whatever it takes. He won't stop. Not ever." "And you?" She met his eyes. "I won't run anymore. I'm tired of running." Something passed between them then. An understanding. A promise neither of them spoke aloud. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Silas was outside, chopping wood, when he saw it. A rider on the ridge. Just one, sitting still, looking down at the cabin. Even from this distance, Silas could tell he was studying the place, memorizing it. He didn't move. Didn't reach for his rifle. Just stood there, axe in hand, watching the watcher. After a long minute, the rider turned and disappeared over the ridge. Silas went inside. Alara saw his face and knew. Someone found us. He nodded. A scout. He'll be back with others. She stood up from the table, slow and careful, her shoulder still stiff. Walked to the corner where his rifle leaned against the wall. Picked it up, checked the load, set it down again. "I should go," she said quietly, "before they come. If I leave, they'll follow me and leave you alone." Silas looked at her. At this woman in his shirt, in his cabin, in his life. He thought about the years ahead, empty and silent, if she walked out that door. He thought about the man on the ridge, about the men who would come, about what they'd do to her if they caught her. "No," he said. She looked at him. "You're not leaving." He crossed the room, took her hands in his. They were cold. He warmed them. "This is your place now. This is your home. And I'll be damned if I let anyone take it from you." Her eyes searched his face. "Silas, they'll kill you. Or worse." "Maybe." He squeezed her hands. "But I've been dead for 10 years. You brought me back. I'm not letting that go." The afternoon passed in preparation. Silas checked every gun, every round of ammunition. Alara packed food, water, blankets, supplies in case they needed to run, though neither of them said it. They worked together, moving around each other like they'd been doing it for years, not weeks. As evening fell, they sat by the fire. The last fire, maybe. The last quiet night. "I should have told you sooner," Alara said. "About everything. About who I really am. You told me what mattered." She shook her head. "No. There's more. Something you need to know." Silas waited. "When I left Philadelphia, when I ran, I wasn't just running from Garrett. I was running toward something. Toward the one place I thought I might be safe." She took a breath. "I have a sister. Younger. She lives in California, near San Francisco. I was trying to reach her when they caught up with me." "A sister." "Her name is Margaret. She doesn't know any of this, doesn't know about Garrett, about what I did, about any of it. I was going to show up on her doorstep and beg for help." Alara laughed, a sad sound. "I had this picture in my head. This dream. That I'd find her and everything would be okay." Silas said nothing. Just let her talk. "I stopped believing in dreams a long time ago. But then I fell off that horse, and you carried me inside, and for the first time in years I thought maybe." She stopped. Swallowed. "Maybe I could stop running. Maybe I could stay." The fire crackled. The wind pushed against the cabin. And Silas Cole realized something that changed everything. Her bag. The one she'd arrived with. The one he'd stored under the bed without really looking at it. He'd seen it weeks ago, half-packed, as if she'd been ready to move at a moment's notice. He'd assumed it was just how she traveled, prepared for anything. But now he understood. That bag wasn't packed for the journey here. It was packed for the journey away. Away from him. He looked at her. At the woman he'd come to love, the woman who'd filled the empty spaces in his life, the woman who'd been ready to leave the moment she was strong enough to walk. "Your bag," he said quietly. "Under the bed." It was packed to go. She went still. The firelight played across her face, showing him everything, the guilt, the fear, the shame of being caught. "I was going to tell you," she whispered. "I was going to explain. But then the days passed, and I kept not leaving, and I thought maybe—" She broke off, looked away. And then Silas realized the truth he'd been too blind to see. Her story about a cruel husband was a lie. Or part of it, anyway. The man she'd killed, the brother who hunted her, that was real. But the running, the constant running, wasn't just about them. It was about her. About who she'd become. About a woman who'd learned that the only person she could trust was herself. She'd been ready to leave him. Even now, even after everything, part of her was still ready to run. The fire popped. A log crumbled, sending sparks up the chimney. And Silas sat in his chair, looking at the woman he loved, understanding for the first time that love might not be enough. That some wounds went too deep. That some people carried their loneliness with them no matter how many others tried to fill it. He should have been angry. Should have felt betrayed. But sitting there, watching her face crumple with the weight of her confession, all he felt was sadness. For her. For himself. For the thousand small ways people hurt each other without meaning to. "Alara," he said. Just her name. Nothing else. She looked up, her eyes bright. "I know you were going to leave. I know you're still thinking about it, probably. It's what you've done. It's how you survived." He leaned forward, his hands on his knees. "But I'm asking you to stay. Not because you have to. Not because you're trapped here by snow or injury or circumstance. But because you want to." She stared at him. "I'm not asking for forever," he continued. "Just for today. Just for tonight. Just for right now, in this moment, choose to stay." The silence stretched between them, long and full and heavy with everything unsaid. And then Alara moved. She stood up from the bed, crossed the small space between them, and lowered herself onto his lap, into his arms, her head against his chest. She didn't speak. Didn't need to. Her arms went around him, and his around her, and they held each other by the fire while the wind howled outside and the world waited to see what would happen next. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't fighting. Sometimes it's staying. Sometimes it's choosing, in the middle of all your fears and all your reasons to run, to plant your feet and say, "Here. I am here. I will stay here." Alara closed her eyes. Silas rested his chin on her hair. The fire burned low, and the night stretched on, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, they both felt something like peace. Dawn broke grey and cold over the Bighorn Mountains. February 3rd, 1890. Silas stood at the window, coffee forgotten in his hand, watching the ridge where he'd seen the rider yesterday. The snow had melted some during a warm spell last week, leaving patches of brown grass like scars on the white landscape. Good for traveling. Bad for hiding. Behind him, Alara slept. He'd carried her to the bed last night after she'd fallen asleep in his arms by the fire. She looked younger in sleep, the worry lines smoothing out, her dark hair spread across his pillow like something from a dream he'd never allowed himself to have. But this wasn't a dream. And the men coming over the ridge weren't imaginary. He saw them at the same moment the first horse appeared. Then another. Then more. He counted. 8, 9, 12 men on horseback, spread out in a line, moving slow and steady toward his cabin. Sunlight caught metal, rifle barrels, belt buckles, a sheriff's badge on the lead rider. Silas set down his coffee. His hand went to the rifle leaning against the wall, but he didn't pick it up. Not yet. "Alara." His voice was quiet, but she woke immediately. That was something he'd noticed about her, the way she could go from sleeping to alert in a heartbeat, like an animal that had learned never to feel safe. She sat up, saw his face, and knew. How many? 12. Sheriff with them. She swung her legs off the bed, wincing slightly at the movement. Her shoulder still bothered her in the cold. She pulled on her boots, fastened them with quick, sure movements, and stood. Walked to him. Looked out the window. Garrett Walsh rode at the front, next to the sheriff. Even from this distance, Silas could see the difference between them. The sheriff was a working man, thick through the middle, his coat stained and worn. Walsh was something else, straight-backed, well-dressed even in the wilderness, his horse a finer animal than any other in the group. Money rode that horse. Money and hate and the kind of determination that came from never being told no. "That's him," Alara said. Her voice was steady. "The one in the dark coat." Silas nodded. He'd known. Didn't need to ask. "What's the plan?" she said. He turned from the window. Looked at her. At this woman who'd fallen into his life and changed everything. At the fear in her eyes that she was trying so hard to hide. At the strength underneath it. The strength that had kept her alive across half a continent. "My land. My fight. You stay inside." She started to argue, but he kept going. "I'm not saying this to protect you. I'm saying it because if you're out there, I'll be watching you instead of watching them. I'll make mistakes. People will get hurt." He touched her face, his rough hand gentle against her cheek. "You stay inside. You stay safe. That's how you help me." She wanted to argue. He could see it in the set of her jaw, the flash in her grey eyes. But she nodded. Stepped back. Moved to the window where she could see without being seen. Silas picked up his rifle. Checked the load. Opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold hit him like a wall. He'd forgotten his coat, but he didn't go back for it. The wind cut through his shirt, raised goosebumps on his arms. He stood on the porch, rifle at his side, and waited. The riders approached slowly. They weren't charging. They weren't spreading out to surround the cabin. They were coming like men who knew they had all the advantages, who had time, who had numbers. They stopped about 50 yards out, far enough to be safe from a rifle shot, close enough to talk. The sheriff rode forward alone. A big man, red-faced from wind and maybe whiskey, his eyes taking in everything. The cabin, the outbuildings, the woodpile, the man on the porch. "Silas Cole," he called out. "Sheriff Maddox. We met once, couple years back, at the general store in Laramie." Silas remembered. A brief conversation about winter feed prices. Nothing important. "I remember." Maddox nodded. "Good. Then you know I'm not here to cause trouble for you. I'm here about a woman. Wanted for murder back east. We have reason to believe she's been staying with you." The wind blew. Silas said nothing. "Mr. Walsh here," Maddox continued, gesturing behind him, "has papers. Legal documents. Warrants from Pennsylvania, signed by a judge. This woman killed his brother. He's got a right to see justice done." Silas looked past the sheriff to the man on the fine horse. Garrett Walsh stared back at him, his face expressionless, his eyes cold as the winter sky. "No woman here," Silas said. Maddox sighed. "Mr. Cole. We tracked her to this valley. We found where her horse died, less than a mile from here. We found tracks leading to your spring. She's here. We know it. You're only making this harder on yourself." Silas said nothing. Behind him, he heard the cabin door creak open. Heard footsteps on the porch. Felt Alara move up beside him. Felt the warmth of her presence even through the cold. "No," he said. Louder this time. "No woman here." Sheriff Maddox's eyes went to Alara. To the woman standing on the porch in a man's shirt and heavy trousers, her hair loose around her shoulders, her chin lifted in defiance. "Mr. Cole," the sheriff said slowly, "who is that standing next to you?" Silas looked at Alara. She looked back. Something passed between them, an understanding, a choice, a promise. "My wife," Silas said. "This is my wife, Alara Cole. She's been here since November. We were married by a circuit judge in Laramie back in the fall, before the snow came." The words hung in the cold air. Alara's hand found his. Squeezed. Behind the sheriff, Garrett Walsh urged his horse forward. The animal stepped delicately through the snow, picking its way like it was too good for this rough country. Walsh stopped next to the sheriff, his eyes fixed on Alara. "Wife," he repeated. The word was flat. Disbelieving. "That's right," Silas said. Walsh looked at Alara for a long moment. Then he laughed. It wasn't a nice sound. "You expect me to believe that? This woman has been running for the better part of a year. She doesn't stop. She doesn't stay. She certainly doesn't marry some dirt farmer in the middle of nowhere." He shook his head. "Nice try, Cole. But no." Silas felt Alara tense beside him. Felt her hand tighten on his. He squeezed back, telling her without words that he was here, that he wasn't going anywhere. "Believe what you want," he said. "She's my wife. She's under my protection. And you're on my land without invitation." Walsh's face hardened. The amusement vanished, replaced by something uglier. "Your land means nothing. Your protection means nothing. That woman is wanted for murder, and I'm taking her back to Pennsylvania to face justice." He looked at the sheriff. "Maddox, do your job." The sheriff shifted in his saddle, looked at Silas, at Alara, at the rifle in Silas's hand, licked his lips. "Mr. Cole, I don't want any trouble. But the law is the law. If she's wanted, I have to bring her in. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Silas raised the rifle, not pointing it at anyone, just holding it where they could see. "The easy way is you turn around and ride out. The hard way is you don't." Behind Walsh and Maddox, the other men shifted. Hands went to rifles. Horses stamped and snorted. The tension stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Alara stepped forward. Just one step, but it put her slightly in front of Silas, slightly between him and the guns. "Garrett," she said. Her voice carried in the cold air. "This is between you and me. Leave him out of it." Walsh smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Him. He's nothing. A distraction. A mistake you made at the end of a long road." He gestured at the cabin, the land, the man beside her. "Look at this place. Look at him. You think this is where you belong? You, who grew up with servants and silk dresses and the best education money could buy." Alara didn't flinch. "I grew up with a lot of things. Most of them weren't worth having. Your brother thought they were." "He wasn't my brother. He was your brother. And he was a monster." Something flickered in Walsh's eyes. Pain, maybe. Or rage. Hard to tell which. "That monster," he said quietly, "was the only family I had. And you took him from me." Alara shook her head. "I took nothing. I defended myself against a man who was about to kill me. If there's blame to place it on him. On you. On everyone who knew what he was and did nothing." The wind picked up, swirling snow around the horse's legs. Walsh sat motionless, his face unreadable. Behind him, the other men waited. "You're not taking her," Silas said. His voice was calm, matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather or the price of feed. "Not today. Not ever." Walsh looked at him. Really looked, for the first time. At the weathered face, the calloused hands, the rifle held easy and familiar. At the eyes that had seen hard winters and harder choices and hadn't blinked yet. "You'd die for her," Walsh said. It wasn't a question. Silas nodded. "I would." "Why? She's nothing to you. A stranger who showed up at your door." Silas thought about that. About the night he'd carried her inside. About the weeks that followed, the conversations by the fire, the small moments that had added up to something he couldn't name. About the way she looked at him now, like he was worth looking at, like he mattered. "She's my wife," he said simply. "That's enough." Walsh stared at him for a long moment. Then he laughed again, but this time the sound was different. Bitter. Tired. Like a man who'd been running just as hard as Alara, just in a different direction. You're a fool, Cole. A romantic fool who's going to die for a woman who would have left you the moment the snow melted. Silas felt Alara stiffen beside him. Felt the truth of Walsh's words land like a physical blow. She would have left. Had been ready to leave. That was the hardest part. Not the threat of violence, not the 12 men with guns, but the knowledge that Walsh was right about that one thing. But that was then. This was now. And the woman standing beside him, her hand in his, wasn't the same woman who'd packed that bag weeks ago. Maybe, Silas said. But she didn't leave. She stayed. That counts for something. Walsh shook his head, opened his mouth to speak, and Alara stepped forward again. All the way forward, off the porch, into the snow. She walked toward the horses, toward the guns, toward the man who'd hunted her across a continent. Silas started after her, but she held up a hand without looking back. Alara, he said. Don't. She kept walking. Stopped about 10 feet from Walsh's horse. Looked up at him. The wind caught her hair, whipped it around her face. You want me, she said. Here I am. But you don't get to hurt him. You don't get to touch him or his land or anything that's his. If you want blood, take mine and go. Walsh looked down at her. For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind howled. A horse stamped. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, brave or foolish, facing winter like that. Get on a horse, Walsh said quietly. Now. And we'll go. Alara nodded. Turned to look at Silas. Their eyes met across the snowy ground, across the distance between them, across everything they'd found and everything they were about to lose. She smiled. Just a little. Just enough. And then Silas stepped off the porch. He walked through the snow, rifle in his hand, until he stood beside her. Faced Walsh and the sheriff and 12 armed men. Faced them with nothing but a woman at his side and a lifetime of loneliness behind him. No, he said. Walsh's jaw tightened. You've made your point, Cole. Don't be a fool. Too late for that. Silas raised the rifle, pointed it at the sky, not at anyone, but the message was clear. She stays. You go. That's the only deal on offer. Behind them, the cabin door stood open. The cast-iron skillet hung on its hook, catching the weak morning light. Inside, a fire burned. A bed waited. A life waited. A future neither of them had imagined until they'd found it together. Sheriff Maddox looked at Walsh. Looked at Silas. Looked at the rifle and the woman and the whole impossible situation. Mr. Walsh, he said slowly, maybe we should talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. With respect, sir, there is. This man claims she's his wife. That's a legal matter. We can't just ride in and take her without proper proceedings. Not if he's willing to fight over it. Walsh stared at him. You're joking. I'm not. The law is the law. If she's married, she's under her husband's protection. We need a court order, a judge's signature, something more than a warrant from another state. Maddox shifted in his saddle. I should have checked on this before we came out here. That's on me. Silas stood very still. Beside him, Alara's hand found his. Walsh looked from the sheriff to Silas to Alara. His face worked through several expressions: anger, frustration, something that might have been grief. Finally, he laughed. The same bitter laugh as before. Married, he said. You actually married her. I did, Silas said. It wasn't true. But standing here, with her hand in his, it felt true. Felt like the most true thing he'd ever said. Walsh shook his head. Gathered his reins. Looked down at Alara one last time. This isn't over, he said. I'll get my papers. I'll get my court order. And I'll be back when the snow melts for good. Enjoy your winter, Mrs. Cole. It's the last one you'll spend free. He turned his horse. Gestured to his men. They followed, a line of dark figures against the snow, riding slowly back toward the ridge. Sheriff Maddox lingered a moment. looked at Silas with something like respect. "You're making a powerful enemy," he said quietly. "Seems I am. Walsh has money. Connections. He'll be back, like he said." Silas nodded. "Then we'll be ready." Maddox shook his head, touched his hat to Alara, turned his horse and followed the others. Silas and Alara stood in the snow and watched them go. Watched until the last rider disappeared over the ridge. Watched until the only movement was the wind and the only sound was their own breathing. Then Alara turned to him, threw her arms around him, buried her face in his chest and held on like she'd never let go. "You crazy fool," she whispered into his shirt. "You wonderful, crazy fool." Silas held her, felt her shake against him, from cold, from relief, from everything. Felt his own heart pounding, still not believing what he'd done, what he'd said, what he'd claimed. "My land," he said quietly into her hair. "My fight. You stay." She looked up at him. Her eyes were wet, but she was smiling. Really smiling, the way he'd never seen her smile before. "I'm staying," she said. "I'm staying." They stood there in the snow, holding each other, while the wind blew around them and the cabin waited and the future stretched out uncertain ahead. They stood there until the cold forced them inside, back to the fire, back to the small world they'd built together. The cast-iron skillet hung on its hook. The fire crackled and popped. And two people who'd started as strangers sat close together and talked about what came next. Spring would come. Walsh would return. There would be fights to fight and battles to win. But that was tomorrow. Today, they had each other. Today, they had this. Sometimes love isn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. Sometimes it's about standing in the snow and saying no. Sometimes it's about choosing someone and being chosen in return, and knowing that whatever comes next, you'll face it together. Silas looked at Alara. She looked at him. And in the firelight, in the warmth of the cabin, in the quiet of the afternoon, they both knew that something had changed. Something had become real. The lone protector wasn't alone anymore. And the fugitive bride had finally found a place to stay. Spring came late to the Bighorn Mountains that year. April arrived with muddy roads and melting snow and the sound of water running everywhere, filling creeks that had been silent for months. The days grew longer, the sun warmer, and the cabin that had held two people through the long winter began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. Silas stood at the spring on a Tuesday morning, watching the water bubble up from the ground, clear and cold and endless. The boot print he'd erased back in November was long gone, washed away by snow and rain and the turning of the seasons. But he remembered it. Remembered the moment he'd chosen to hide it, to protect someone he didn't even know yet. Behind him, a small voice called out, "Papa! Papa, look!" He turned. His son, 3 years old now, with his mother's grey eyes and his father's serious expression, stood at the edge of the spring, holding a rock in his small hand. Behind him, Alara watched from the cabin door, a cloth in her hands, a smile on her face. 3 years. It had been 3 years since the posse rode away. 3 years since Silas stood on his porch and claimed a stranger as his wife. 3 years of mornings and evenings, of planting and harvest, of learning each other in all the small ways that add up to a life. Walsh had come back, just as he'd promised. Twice. The first time with a lawyer and a court order that fell apart when the judge learned the full story of what his brother had done. The second time alone, on horseback, staying for 3 days while the snow melted around them. He'd left on the third morning, shaking Silas's hand at the door, his eyes meeting Alara's one last time. He loved him, Alara had said that night, her head on Silas's chest. His brother. Despite everything, he loved him. "Grief does strange things to people," Silas had answered. "Makes them crazy. Makes them do things they wouldn't otherwise do." He seemed different at the end. Lighter, somehow. Maybe he finally let go. They hadn't seen him since. Hadn't heard from him. Sometimes Silas wondered if he was still out there, still carrying that weight. But most days, he didn't think about Walsh at all. Most days, he thought about now. Papa. The boy held up the rock, proud of his find. "Look." Silas walked over and knelt beside his son, took the rock gently and examined it. It was just a rock, grey, smooth, unremarkable in every way. But to the boy, it was treasure. "That's a good one," Silas said. "Want to try skipping it?" The boy nodded vigorously. Silas showed him how to hold it, how to stand, how to flick his wrist. The rock flew out, hit the water, and sank with a plunk. The boy's face fell. "Again," Silas said. "Took me 100 tries before I got it right." They tried again. And again. Each rock sank. Each plunk brought a fresh wave of determination to the boy's face. On the 7th try, the rock skipped once. Just once, barely, before disappearing. But it skipped. The boy shouted with joy. Spun around to find his mother, to share the news. Alara had walked down from the cabin, her arms crossed against the morning chill, her eyes soft as she watched them. "Did you see, Mama? Did you see?" "I saw," she said. "You're a natural." The boy beamed. Ran off to find more rocks, his small legs carrying him across the wet grass toward the pile by the fence. Silas stood and walked to Alara. She leaned into him, and he put his arm around her, and they watched their son together. "He looks like you when he concentrates," she said. "He looks like you when he smiles." She laughed. It was a sound he never tired of, a sound that had become as familiar as the wind or the creak of the cabin door. 3 years of hearing that laugh, and it still made something warm bloom in his chest. They'd had a real wedding, eventually. A circuit judge had come through in June of that first year, and they'd stood in front of him with their neighbors as witnesses. The first time Silas had invited anyone to his land since he'd built the cabin. Afterward, they'd had a small celebration, pies, and coffee and laughter that echoed off the mountains. The cabin had changed since then. Added a room onto the back when they learned Alara was expecting. A real bed, bigger than the one he'd slept in for a decade. More shelves, more cups, more signs of life. The cast-iron skillet still hung in its place, but now it was never empty for long. Biscuits, cornbread, pancakes for the boy on Sunday mornings. The skillet that had reflected a sliver of calico now reflected a family. "Penny for your thoughts," Alara said. Silas shrugged. "Just thinking about that first morning, when I saw you in the skillet." She tilted her head. "The skillet?" "In the reflection. That morning, before I found you. I was making coffee, and I saw a bit of color in the skillet surface. Calico. Your dress, I figure, catching the light somehow. It made no sense at the time." Alara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I remember that morning. I was hiding in the trees, watching your cabin, trying to decide if I should knock or keep going. I must have stood there for an hour, just frozen." "What made you stay?" "I don't know. Something about the way you moved. Slow and careful, like you had all the time in the world. Like nothing could rush you." She smiled. "I'd been running so long, I'd forgotten what that looked like." The boy came running back, his hands full of rocks, his face flushed with excitement. "More, Papa. Let's try more." Silas looked at Alara. She nodded. "All right," he said. "But you have to listen. Watch how I do it." They spent the morning at the spring, the three of them. Silas showed his son how to choose the right rocks, flat, smooth, not too heavy. Alara sat on a fallen log and cheered for every skip, no matter how small. The sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the morning chill, and by noon the boy had managed 3 skips in a row. "Look, Mama. 3. That's as many as my fingers." "It is," Alara said. "You're getting so big." The boy puffed up with pride. Then he spotted something in the grass, a flower, the first of the season, small and yellow and brave against the lingering cold. He picked it carefully and brought it to his mother. "For you." Alara took the flower like it was made of gold, held it to her nose, though it had no scent, touched it to her cheek. "Thank you, my love. It's beautiful." The boy nodded, satisfied. Ran back to the spring to find more rocks. Silas watched his wife watch their son. Watched the way her eyes followed him, the way her hand held the flower, the way she sat in the morning light like she'd been there forever, like she'd always been there, like the years before her arrival were a dream he was slowly forgetting. "You're staring," she said without looking at him. "You're worth staring at." She turned, and her eyes met his, and something passed between them, the same thing that had passed that first night in the cabin, the same thing that had grown through the long winter, the same thing that had carried them through Walsh's visits and the birth of their son and all the small crises of building a life together. "I love you," she said. Simple. Direct. The way she said everything now. "I love you too." The words still felt new, even after 3 years. He'd gone so long without saying them, without hearing them, that each time felt like a gift. Each time felt like a small miracle. The boy called out, "Papa, come see. I found a frog." Silas went, knelt by the spring with his son and looked at the small creature clinging to a rock. The frog blinked at them. The boy giggled. "He's funny looking." "He is. Can we keep him? He lives here. This is his home. We'd be taking him away from everything he knows." The boy considered this. Nodded solemnly. "Okay. We can visit him." "That's a good plan." They stayed by the spring until the sun was high and Alara called them in for lunch. The boy ran ahead, eager to tell his mother about the frog. Silas walked more slowly, his eyes on the cabin ahead, on the smoke rising from the chimney, on the woman standing in the doorway waiting for them. He thought about the man he'd been 4 years ago. The lonely man who'd mistaken solitude for strength. The man who'd erased a footprint without knowing why, who'd carried a stranger through the snow, who'd claimed her as his wife in front of 12 armed men. That man seemed like someone else now. A ghost. A memory. The cabin door closed behind them. The fire crackled. Alara set out bread and cheese and cold meat, and the boy talked through every bite, his words tumbling over each other in his hurry to share everything. Silas listened. Alara listened. The afternoon light streamed through the window, warm and golden. After lunch, the boy napped. Silas sat on the porch with his coffee, looking out at his land, at the spring where they'd spent the morning, at the ridge where the posse had first appeared. The ridge was empty now, just grass and sky and the slow drift of clouds. Alara came out and sat beside him. She didn't speak, just leaned against him and watched the same view, the same sky, the same land. "Happy?" she asked after a while. He considered the question. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give it the weight it deserved. "Yes," he said. "I am." "Me too." They sat together until the boy woke up, until the afternoon faded toward evening, until the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Then they went inside, the three of them, to the fire and the supper and the ordinary miracle of another day together. The cast-iron skillet hung on its hook, reflecting the firelight, reflecting the room, reflecting a family where once there had been only one. It had seen a lot, that skillet. It would see more. Winters and springs, joys and sorrows, the endless turning of days. But for now, on this spring evening in 1893, it reflected 3 faces around a table, holding hands, giving thanks for food and warmth and each other. Outside, the wind blew soft across the Bighorn Mountains. The spring bubbled up from the ground, cold and clear and endless. And on the ridge where a posse had once appeared, there was nothing but grass and sky and the slow, peaceful drift of clouds. Some stories end with battles. Some end with goodbyes. But the best stories end like this, quietly, gently, with people who love each other sitting together at the end of an ordinary day. The lone protector had found his purpose. The fugitive bride had found her home. And in a small cabin in Wyoming, under a vast western sky, they lived their lives together, one day at a time, building something that would last long after they were gone. That's the thing about love. It doesn't always arrive the way you expect. Sometimes it comes in the middle of the night, carried by a stranger with nothing but the clothes on her back. Sometimes it grows slowly, through long winters and hard choices and the simple act of staying. Sometimes it takes years to recognize, and then one day you look around and realize it's been there all along, as steady and constant as the spring that gives you water, as warm and bright as the fire that gives you light. Silas Cole learned that lesson later than most. But he learned it well. And every morning when he woke to the sound of his wife's breathing and the patter of his son's feet, he gave thanks for the night he'd carried a stranger through the snow, and for the choice he'd made without knowing why. The skillet hung on the wall. The coffee waited on the stove. And outside, the spring bubbled up from the ground, cold and clear and endless, ready for whatever came next.